start recording and go ahead and get it started. Um, Again, if you just joined us, if you could please enter your name and your club into the chat feature. We'd like to try to track who's here. The other thing I'll mention as we get started tonight is that I know many of you just received an email late afternoon about tryouts and team formation. We are not going to talk about that tonight. If we get questions on that, we're going to defer them till tomorrow. Really, tonight's about the return to play. So I know there's probably some questions and some interesting discussion, but I'm just going to set that right up front that we're not going to move into that topic tonight, as we want to keep things looking at the other information for tonight. So welcome. For those who don't know me, I'm Dan Cataldi, the Executive Director for Iowa Soccer, and I appreciate you guys taking time on a Thursday night to come out and listen to kind of the information we have to share, the reasoning behind our decision to move the return to play date into July, and kind of what's next. So I want to start by, most of the Iowa soccer team is on this call, if not all. So I want to start by thanking them. For the last 2 months, we've undergone, considerable change, considerable world events that have been unprecedented, as you all know. And the team at Iowa Soccer has been working nonstop, running contingencies, identifying what we can do differently, talking to clubs, working with clubs, really trying to figure out what the best approach is to come back. Can we play this summer? Can we play in the spring? What does the fall look like? All at the same time, switching our registration platform over to Demisphere, as many of you know. So really the team at Iowa Soccer has been fantastic to work with as we've gotten through this. And I hope the communications you've received from Jenny, representing much of our team, have been sufficient, and you found them useful as we've tried to communicate with you, as on a weekly basis as we've made decisions. So I wanted to start with that. What I wanted to do next was just talk a little bit about who I am. So, I've shared this with some of the clubs, and I've been told I should share with all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and how it's led to our decisions, kind of the way we've approached this entire scenario. So I started my career with a master's degree in human genetics, and I was actually board certified in a clinical genetics area, worked with patients. So I have experience in the medical field, which certainly helps with some of this. Not the same thing, but it does help me assess some of the data as we move forward. I then left that profession and went back and got a master's in public administration. I spent before I came here, 9 years with the Red Cross, often leading very large scale operations throughout the country. So I've been in these types of situations where we're making difficult decisions. We're trying to process a lot of information quickly and do the right thing. And I always use the term, we make imperfect decisions with incomplete information. And it's a lot of what we're doing right now. So I just want to share that kind of as my background, so you know that as we've approached this, we've done this very methodically, very logically, data-driven, trying to take all of the politics out of it, everything, and just look at what's right. So how we got here, essentially, throughout this entire thing, our fundamental approach has been prioritizing safety. I've said from the beginning, we're not going to be the first to bring kids together. You're not going to see kids not able to go to school but coming to soccer practice where they've run the risk of transmission. So we've approached it at every aspect of that's what we want to go with first. I've also used the term a lot, because you can does not mean you should. We all can acknowledge now the irony of us sending that email out at the same time yesterday. Our governor was opening the state up in a lot of ways. Still not to use sports. So there's still a ban on mass gatherings over 10 people. So it's not like we could go play today if we wanted to. But just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. And I think that's something we want to stress, that we're looking at the safety of the players. So we know we're in a time of uncertainty. You look at businesses as they have the option to open up, and you see some saying we're not going to open up until mid to late June. Others are jumping to open tomorrow. So it's really that we don't know. There's a lot of information out there. Not all of it is really verifiable at this point. So we're trying to do the best we can to understand the information, which takes us back to that making imperfect decisions with incomplete information. We are doing the best we can to look at the real data, look at the real numbers, and make assessments based on that may be imperfect, but then it takes us back to our first priority, which is when we're going to be imperfect, we're going to err on the side of safety for the kids. And that's going to be the fundamental way we approach this, and we continue to approach it. So I hope you appreciate that the message we sent out yesterday and the call tonight is based on those fundamentals, based on that approach, and it will be the way we continue to approach things. So that's how we've gotten here. So that decision was based heavily on conversations I had with Dr. Stacey Klutts, who's joining us tonight, which is, I suspect, the reason many of you are on the call, the opportunity to hear what he has to say. And so I'm going to turn it over to him briefly. I want to start by saying thanks to John Cook with ISC. Dr. Klutts has kids that play in that club. And so John connected us. And those that read the email yesterday saw Dr. Klutts' impressive credentials. But I just want to share the quick overview for those that maybe didn't have a chance. He has an MD and a PhD in biochemistry. More importantly, he went to the same undergrad as my parents. So that's a very important thing. And he's a Chiefs fan, so he's got that going for him. He's the Chief of Pathology and Laboratory Service at the Central Iowa VA Healthcare System, Staff Pathologist and Medical Director of Microbiology and Chemistry at the Iowa City VA Healthcare System, a Clinical Associate Professor of Pathology at the University of Iowa. He's the Chair of the National VA Clinical Microbiology Council and the President of the Academy of Clinical Laboratory Physicians and Scientists. And that's just a small part of his very long CV that I've reviewed. It's pretty impressive. But he has been really key in the way we've driven some of these decisions. He's working with a team, so it's not just him. He's got other scientists and medical experts behind him. He's just the face of it for us that has put together some of the data we've shared with you and some of the ways we came to the decisions we've come. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Klutts to take a few minutes to kind of walk through his approach and how we came to the idea that July 6th is the right time to bring kids back to play in Iowa.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up? Yeah. All right. Cool. All right. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. We'll go to that. All right. So hopefully everybody can see that okay. So what I thought I would do is just give a number of you, if not all of you, have seen this. Dan sent it out in the email.
I don't think I can't. Yeah, I can't see your screen. Can anybody else?
Okay. Your screen sharing. Huh.
I can
You guys can see it. Okay.
I can see it.
All right.
Yep.
For whatever reason, I can't. So okay,
Yeah.
that's right. I have all the slides.
Okay. So if you can't see it, I'm very happy to send out this very short slide deck. This is again just like 5 or 6 slides. So and so people could, and again this is recorded, so you could potentially follow along later if need be. Presumably this would be on the recorded version too. So again, you've likely seen this timeline. This is actually version 4 or 5. We started off with some different dates. We started off with some slightly different ideas, but this is the version that you've seen, and I kind of want to go through the derivation of this. Where did this come from? This wasn't just pulled out of the air. So if you will, just give me a few minutes, and I'll try to go through this. So just a couple of words about where we got our source of guidelines and information. First is the CDC. I'll go through this or portions of this in just a second. This is the Opening Up America Again guidelines. Many states are not actually following the CDC guidelines, but most of us in the field actually think they're fairly well conceived. They are generally evidence-based, as much evidence as we have for this particular viral pandemic, but it does draw on experience of a lot of other epidemics across the world and even in historically within the U.S. and tries to actually bring things back in a metered, phased fashion, as we'll see in just a second. I lean pretty heavily on the University of Washington's model. If you've actually heard much in the media, this is a model that a lot of people use. It's quite complex. It has a lot of elements to it. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it tonight, but I will talk a little bit about this model in just a sec. And then, of course, as most of you maybe are doing, IDPH, watch their data as well. This is real-time data. There are caveats within this data that I really won't go into either, just with regards to how some of it is compiled behind the scenes. But still, it's still a useful data tool for us, even if it is imperfect. And then finally, I had multiple conversations with a small ad hoc committee through Iowa Soccer Club. So John Cook had put out a few weeks ago a call to action for any of the parents here in the Iowa City, Coralville, North Liberty area that are parents within the ISC club that might have medical or scientific backgrounds, which is very wise. As most of you know, the University of Iowa is here, and we have a lot of medical professionals in this town who this is their job. This is what they do every day, including myself. And so we actually had 12 of us that met and discussed various issues relating to this. We listened to John and his perspective on the soccer side, and then put that together with our expertise. So a lot of this actually comes not just from the data itself, but also fully understanding the questions at hand. You can't really advise anyone about something like this unless you fully understand, or at least as best as you can understand, the questions that are truly being asked. And then, as Dan mentioned, he and I have had conversations as well, both over the phone and by email, about various aspects of this. He's had a number of excellent questions, and I really appreciate his scientific background and our ability to be able to discuss some of these issues at a really high level. So thanks to Dan for that. So that's the sources. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the CDC's Opening Up America Again guidelines. You may or may not have seen these. These are very prevalent in the healthcare sector. We are using these as general guidelines. So to open back up, there are certain steps that have to be met. The first one is to meet a certain set of gating criteria before you even can go into the phased reopening. And that includes reaching a peak of cases in either a state or a region, whatever area you're talking about. After you reach that peak, observe a downward trajectory of cases over a 14-day period. That's easier said than done. We'll talk in a minute about plateaus and various things that tend to happen in these types of scenarios. In fact, it's very common with COVID in places that have gotten on the other side of this case peak. Once you've actually met these initial gating criteria, then you're allowed to enter phase 1 of reopening. Now, this is a very cautious phase. This is very metered. Vulnerable individuals are still supposed to shelter in place. Social settings of greater than 10 are to be avoided. Many common areas where you might see larger congregations of people are to be closed. Masks and social distancing still remain essential. So the point here is that the virus has not left the community, but there is a reduction in the amount of virus to the point to where you can start to slowly phase back in many of the activities that had been completely suspended. Importantly, in this particular phase, organized youth activities should and are recommended to be suspended, and schools are to remain closed. So we did not feel that phase 1 was a time when you could bring back youth sports of any kind, including youth soccer. So, and as we'll see in a second, we're not even into phase 1 yet in the state of Iowa. Once you reach or get into phase 1, in order to actually progress through the cycle, you need to next maintain no evidence of any rebound in numbers of cases for 14 days. So as you see that trajectory going down, what you don't want to see is a rise back up. And if you do, we'll talk about on the little guideline or the little timeline I saw or showed you, we'll see what happens. You kind of have to start over. And then, but once you do get through phase 1 and have 2 weeks with no rebound in cases, then you can enter phase 2. And phase 2 is the point to where we felt it was okay to begin safely allowing conditional return to soccer play. It will not look like your typical soccer. There will be training with some caveats. There will still be some safety measures that are likely to be in place Many of those, I think, are still under discussion as to exactly what those recommendations will be. But in this situation, you can reopen schools and youth organized activities. You still don't want large gatherings of more than 50, so this is probably not a time to restart competition. But this is when we thought conditional phase soccer training could re-begin. And then just to complete this, steps 5 and 6, step 5 is that you have to stay in phase 2 for at least 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, depending on the situation, and show no evidence of rebounding cases. And that allows you to enter phase 3. And this is where you can have your larger public venues to begin opening. There's very little virus in the community. And then you can open those still with some social distancing protocols. And it's at this point where we think phased competition can be resumed. So where are we now? So this was pulled yesterday from the University of Washington's website. So this is the actual confirmed infections that are in the state of Iowa. So this isn't the US, this is actually Iowa data. And it's a couple of days behind, but you can see actually it looks like we've reached a peak and we're starting to come down. What typically happens in these infections, though, is that in these situations is it's not just an up and a down. Usually it's an up and then a plateau. And indeed, there's a little bit of missing data here. The reasons for which are somewhat complex, but have to do with when cases were reported. So there's actually a little bit of extra data here. So it's not really quite the steep of a drop. It's a little bit more shallow. And then over the past few days, I kind of added this in here myself with some red lines. It appears to have actually plateaued. And if you look at the IDPH data, it looks very similar. Again, if you kind of fill in the backside of that curve and move some of those cases around because they're slightly off as to exactly where they belong in that curve, it looks like that we've reached the peak and we're beginning the plateau phase. So if you go back to the timeline, I think actually we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is fantastic because I think we're going to need that wiggle room. So the initial projection from the University of Washington was that Iowa would hit its peak on May 21st. I think we might have actually hit that in the first week of May. And I think now we're just a few days into the plateau period. How long this plateau period lasts is going to vary. Some places model it as 3 to 4 weeks. Some places model it as just a week. To be safe, I went ahead and put this down to be about 3 weeks or so, 2 to 3 weeks, and putting us up to June 8th. Again, that is a best educated guess based on the models. We'll talk here in a second. I'm a little concerned about this particular phase and whether or not we're going to be able to maintain it. And a lot of that has to do with some of the policies that were put forth yesterday. But once we get through the plateau period and we start seeing a decline in cases on the other side of the plateau, then we're going to be looking for that 14-day downward trend for 2 weeks. And then at that point, we can enter phase 1. And then once we're in phase 1, hopefully we can hold in the phase 1 for 14 days. And that puts us right at July 6th. So that's the derivation of where July 6th came from. Could this possibly have been a few days before that? Maybe. It's highly unlikely, but it's possible that we might have been able to shave a few days off of this. But we didn't want to throw a date out there and then have to just keep extending over and over again because we know that that's difficult for clubs to do. And I know Dan has put out that it's also not feasible to say July 6th and then say, oh, never mind, it's earlier. That's also very tricky for clubs to pull off as well. So that's where the July 6th date comes from. I have dotted lines on here that you can see that actually point to something that I hope doesn't happen but may, which is that if at any point during this process we begin to see reaccumulation of cases in Iowa, significant accumulation. I mean, one-day blip is not necessarily what this means. It means that you really start to see a trend line back up. And again, we're watching this every day in healthcare very, very closely. And I've told Dan that I will be watching this with a mind's eye on soccer as well. But if we start seeing a trend back up, then we're going to have to restart the process and think about where we are and recalibrate. Could the second run through something like this be shortened a little bit? Possibly, depending on what the epidemiology looks like. But at least this gave us a framework under which we could work and think about this whole process moving forward. So I showed you a little bit of the University of Washington data. I didn't show you a lot of the modeling. A lot of this is the actual infection data. But a lot of the models are now converging. There's a model at the University of Washington. There are models at Johns Hopkins. There are models at the CDC, and other smaller entities have models as well. They weren't agreeing all that well. They were disagreeing somewhat for some time. But over the past 3 to 4 weeks, they've actually started to all agree, which in that particular field, when all the models converge and start to agree, that means the data is starting to become quite reliable. Unfortunately, now that all the models are beginning to agree, many areas of the country are beginning to reopen. And there are multiple articles about this in the lay press. This is from the New York Times from yesterday, I believe, or day before yesterday, that talks about how these models could all be thrown off. I think for us, having a July 7th date allows us to wait and see a little bit to see how this plays out and to follow this along. But certainly, there's some concern in Iowa in that if you look at all of the University of Washington models and for Iowa, they had assumed that any gathering restrictions or any business closures were going to be through August 4th. Obviously, that's not the case, but with reopening beginning this week. So how these models actually move forward, not sure. A lot of it will depend on what happens. So we'll see what happens with cases over the next 3 weeks, and it will probably take 2 to 3 weeks for those policy changes to really bear fruit. So it's not going to be next week that we're going to know. It'll be a little bit. So that's all I had. I just wanted to try to give you the framework, the scientific framework to how we got to that timeline. It's, as Dan said, it's not perfect. The crystal balls for this are not crystal clear. There are elements of it that are quite clear, but many of the elements are still somewhat fuzzy. We're working on the best data sets, or with the best data sets that we have. But at the same time, this is definitely something where you don't want to have kids out mixing during a time when there's high levels of virus and disease in the community. As those kids, when they mix, not only pose a bit of a risk to each other, but more importantly, you're mixing of households, and they pose a significant risk to the population as a whole. When they potentially bring it home, they're actually pretty good infectious disease vectors, if you will. Anyway, Dan, that's all I have. But I'm more than happy to answer any, or try to answer any questions that anyone might have. And I don't know how you want to approach questions, if you want to have people just chime in or do chat box, etc.
Sure. Well, let me let's do this. So we'll take some questions here, Matt. I just want to kind of follow that up with where do we go now, so everybody kind of is on the same page, and then we'll take questions from everybody, and we'll monitor the chat room as well as opening. You can unmute yourself and ask the questions. I will say, if you have not already, please enter your name and club in the chat box. We're trying to track that, so if you could do that now, that'd be great if you haven't already done so. But with that information we just got, and again, Dr. Klutts will stay on to take some questions here in a minute if there are any. But I want to talk about kind of like the next steps. And so we sent out the email yesterday that talked about 4 essential phases. Phase 1 is current, and that's where we are now. No sanctioned activity, as far as physical interaction. You can still do virtual training. It can be coach-led virtual training, that kind of thing. Those are still okay. We know a lot of clubs are trying to do that, trying to create new ways of bringing the kids together. So that is acceptable. On July 6th is when we anticipate moving into phase 2, and that's that conditional training. Right now, we're not prepared to tell you what those conditions are because we want to kind of assess over the next couple of months how things are looking. It may be small groups. You know, we may have the requirement within the state where we still can't have groups of more than, say, 20, which may limit the group size we can have. We may have we may have fewer restrictions, which allow us to kind of ease it a little bit more. So we're not quite there. We do plan to send out at least a couple of weeks before we move into that phase, a very thorough kind of requirements and suggestions document, things you'll have to do, basic hygiene. One easy example, I know, traditionally you just throw a bunch of pennies out and tell kids to go, half of them go pick up a penny and then throw it back in the pile. That's not going to be the way we do it anymore. Each kid's going to need to be assigned a penny where they take home, wash it themselves, and bring it back to prevent the kind of changing and the mixing that way. So all those basic hygiene things we're going to put out as we get there. So that's going to be phase 2. From there, we'll move to phase 3, which is more unrestricted training. And again, we don't know how long phase 2 will last. If we see on July 6th, we've already maybe moved a little past where we expected to be. Phase 2 may be a very short period, maybe a week or two, because we're already through that on the curve. And then we'll move into phase 3, which is really almost, I don't want to say unrestricted, but more close to unrestricted training. And we want to give all the clubs at least a week or two at that level where you're back to essentially full-sided, fewer restrictions, fewer requirements, and getting back that way. And then shortly after phase 3, the idea is that once we're at phase 3, we're essentially ready for phase 4, which is competitions, inter-club activity. And so, again, we don't know how long phase 3 will last, but as soon as we're ready, we'll move into phase 4. We would expect phase 3 to be very short, though. Really, it's about getting the kids accustomed to playing full-sided again before we move in. If all goes well, the end of July, early August, we'll be back to phase 4. But we want to prepare everybody that that's not necessarily how it's going to go. Obviously, we don't control this. It's the ideal and really where we want to be. We're hoping, obviously, by the end of July, we're back in competition mode. We're preparing for a full fall schedule. The traditional events we have, the traditional cup, we still have ODP tryouts scheduled for August 8th. So, all of that's we're anticipating all of that and still expecting all of that to take place with the current modeling. So that's kind of the end of the presentation we have.